Hi folks, Tacitus today at your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about should women's sport or women's athletes and even in the the A grade level, the elite level sports, should they be rewarded to the same extent as men's sport when men's sport has such a more substantial following. We can look at things, for example, soccer tournaments. Now, the amount of eyeballs that watch men's soccer are something in the region of, I think it was 42 to 1, as opposed to women's sport or women's soccer. And so the revenues, as in advertising revenues, those sorts of things, they they're far greater for men, and so the male athletes are rewarded accordingly. I think we all know, some of these elite male athletes in, say, American gridiron, soccer, and so on. They're paid huge bucks. Their careers are relatively short, of course, but nonetheless paid huge dollars. Now, the argument that particularly those who want to undermine and destroy the social cohesion of the Western world insist that, well, shouldn't women's sport achieve equal outcomes with men's sport, even though they can't attract the following and the eyeballs? Well, the reason they can't attract the following is because all those damn fucking Nazis. That's why. If it wasn't for those damn fucking Nazis, then there would be exactly equal amounts of people watching men's and women's sports. Of course, that's utterly and totally absurd, if not an expression of current day insanity. But let's sort of have a look at it, because I think if women's sport was of the same caliber, then more people would watch it. Whether it be exactly the same numbers, I don't know. But the majority, not all, but the majority of sports watchers are men. And so any sports watcher, I guess, particularly male sports watchers, they're wanting the highest level of competition. It's probably the last area in the Western world, at least, where competition is considered acceptable, even though clearly some games are rigged. It's still it's the last area where merit counts, so even though that's being dismantled at a rate of knots. So let's look at what got me onto this. I was thinking about doing a video of this a while ago, and it's often the case. Somebody does something that's causes me to think, I'll dust off that information that I'd started putting together. And now this was a case where the women's US women's national soccer team, that's considered to be the elite of the elite in terms of women's soccer, they were beaten by a bunch of, I think it's 50-year-olds, just a local team in England, or it might have been Wales, but in Britain somewhere. They got beaten 12-0 by this team of old men. Well, not old men, I mean 50, sort of not quite ancient, but guys who'd be 15 years plus beyond their prime, who had to give up playing competitively because they'd had injuries to knees and ankles and so on. So anyway, this is so the women's team lost 12-0. Now, as I understand it, they didn't even go for the full 90 minutes. I think they stopped at half time because the women are getting hammered. Now, I watched a couple of minutes of it, and these men made the women look like, not just amateurish, made them look like amateur children. They looked like uncoordinated sort of 9 or 10-year-olds. They had no chance of competing against these men. And you're looking at one man dribbling the ball and kicking it around, and he's able to step around 4 or 5 women players and go and score a goal. Now, the guy was pretty good, but he wasn't that good. But compared to the women, he's much better. Now, this is the similar, I think, a 14-year-old local boys soccer team, I think it was in Texas, beat the women's, again, the US women's national team, the creme de la creme of women's soccer. This local team of schoolboys beat them 5-2. Now that's not even, is it the national team of schoolboys, 14-year-old schoolboys? No. Is it the regional championship side? No. It must be at least the Texas championship. No. Well, it must be the Dallas championship. No. It's actually a local team of schoolboys. So these guys are 3 or 4 levels below the national sort of elite level, these schoolboys, and they still beat the women's soccer team 5-2. I mean, now that's not an illustration of the skill of the boys' team, and congratulations to them, of course. It's really that the women's team they're living in a fantasy world to think that they're at any elite level and that they're deserving of a big following, and like the lesbian players in the team, that they're deserving of equal pay with men. Cause well, they don't really know why, just cause equality, equity, equal outcomes. So now I'd also bring the Australian women's soccer team, which is again supposed to be one of the top 3, I think, women's soccer team in the world, and they got beaten, I think it was 7-1 by a team of schoolboys in a rural regional side. Now these guys, these schoolboys, again, I think they were 14 or 15. These schoolboys, again, aren't the national team or the best team or anything like that, far from it. They're just a regional side in a semi-rural area of Australia. And the Australian women's soccer team got beaten 7-1 by these kids. I mean, that's insane. Now, there are other examples of this all over the place, where the number 1 and number 2 women's tennis player in the world were both thrashed by the men's 500th player in the world. And in between him thrashing those 2 players, he sat down and had a cigarette. That's how that's how casual it was. And he barely broke a sweat in beating these 2 Wimbledon. These are Wimbledon, current Wimbledon champions, by the way, not champions from 100 years ago or something. So that shows that even the 500th ranked male tennis player in the world can not just beat but thrash the women's Wimbledon champions. So I don't know, how far down the line do you have to go before you can find a man, as in the rankings, a man that even a Wimbledon women's champion could beat? So now I've seen being involved in. Oh, by the way, I've got no problem with women athletes. I've dated a lot of women athletes, and I married a woman who's 5'11" inches tall, and she's an athlete, or was. She's not now. So I've got no problem with it. I'm fine with it. Do I think it's equal to men's sport? Do I think the reward should be equal? Well, of course not. Of course not. Until the standard becomes equal, the standard of playing, and that standard of equality isn't achieved by lowering the standard for men. Only men who are 90 years old are allowed to play against women, or something. That. So, but being involved in martial arts, I noticed that there was sort of a big move in to use martial arts, because martial arts clubs, they're usually all volunteers. They don't really make any money, and they're quite dedicated, and they've got so the government, various governments in Australia and elsewhere, started giving money to these clubs, provided they had to have a higher representation of women and black and brown people and so on. So it was almost a mandatory thing, and then that permeated schools, and schools were sort of told, "Hey, girls, you go there and join a judo or a karate or Brazilian jiu-jitsu or something like it, wrestling, anything, get into some martial arts." So they did, and started going in large numbers. But then, because men's and women's tournaments are separated, they don't have integrated tournaments. but you could see that it was kind of heading in that way, and being pushed by the government and the public service, and by giving grants and inducements to the owners of clubs and to coaches and judo associations or jiu-jitsu associations that were getting government grants, provided they delivered on the on this gender equity and so on stuff. Now the problem is that the difference between men and women in competitive martial arts is as wide as it is on soccer and other sports. So they started doing things like having pre-tournament tournaments. So the official tournament was still had the men's division and the women's division. Then they started having pre-tournaments where it would be mixed. And to be fair, if girls and women want to compete at the elite level, they have to now practice with men. It's almost mandatory, just to get that extra competition and so on. And you'll find that the women that are winning the tournaments in the martial arts, they've got they're practicing with men, in the moves and again in sort of semi-type competitive tournaments. But I just wanted to sort of indicate again the difference. So now here's a woman who's the state champion. She's came third in the national championships in the women's division. She's a champion. She's like a jiu-jitsu champion and a wrestling champion, and she's a weightlifting champion. So very in women's sports, you don't get people much more accomplished than her. She's like 5'7", sort of 168 centimeters tall, and weighs about 200 pounds. So anyway, she's now in a pre-tournament. She's up against a guy who hasn't been doing it very long. He'd be like early mid-50s, and again, he's not quite a beginner, but he's not far off being a beginner. She's been doing it for 10 plus years. He's been doing it for 6 months. That type of difference. And he beats her in the tournament. So she's maybe 19, 20 years old. And you see this sort of same thing. Now the lengths that the media or the authorities, the sort of angry lesbian brigade go to try and pretend again this fantasy world they like to create, that women are equal, if not better than men. They there's one case here where this is in a judo tournament. They get a girl from outside of the state, and then so they register her as a beginner. So she's actually a brown belt or a black belt. So she's like at the at the apex of the women's side of it, and so they register as a beginner, and then they put her in against boys who are beginners, real beginners. So that she's this very fit, athletic girl, very accomplished in the women's division, but they put her in as a beginner. So she's up against these pudgy boys, with no confidence and who are pushed into it by their parents to do judo because they're getting bullied at school or something. And so it's that sort of boy is there. It's not the tough boys, the aggressive boys, the fit boys. It's not them. But she's up against the boy, and she goes through them, beats them handily, even breaks the arm of one of them with doing elite level moves that only elite level competitor could do. So she beats all these boys, and then the media's, of course, on site go, there you go. You go, girl. You go. You beat those. You show those boys who's boss, and so on. But the whole thing was a setup. There's another one that I was actually at where they stage matched the whole thing. They brought in there was a special bunch of kids that were brought in to do. This was judo again, but they're all handicapped boys. They either had physical or mental handicaps. And so they were brought in, and then they got the girl who was the Australian champion, by the way, in judo, and they put these boys up against her, and of course she beats them all, and the media's there to take photographs, and you go girl. And they made out that these boys were competent judo guys who were doing really well, and there was an evenly matched competition, but the girl was just way better and kicked boy ass around the place. Nothing to be further from the truth. These were a bunch of handicapped boys. They had the coordination of a piece of jelly, and this girl's the Australian champion, and so I mean the outcome was obvious, and so it was ridiculous the extent and level they went to stage manage. Now, this same girl would be beaten within 20 seconds if she's up against the Australian champion boy in her division. And so anyway, just looking at the wider implications here, should women be or girls be given the same reward? Now, again, if the standard is the same, I don't mind. I'm fine with that. But the standard isn't the same. It's vastly different, whether you look at soccer or tennis or martial arts or whatever. So now the other thing that sort of I noticed, and I had a look at it again a little while ago, was that many of the most prominent women's sports are government supported to the point where they wouldn't even exist without taxpayer funding. So there's a division of there's one women's sport where they get something to the tune of $40 million a year in grants, and they get given special special dispensations for some of the bigger arenas. Now, even when they have as in a championship match, if you want to call it, in this sport, they're lucky to get more than a few thousand people to come and watch, and a lot of the tickets, attendance tickets, are given out for free to family and friends and so on in order to bump the numbers. But according to the people I know in the booking agency, they'd be lucky to get 1,000. Now they're given a 20,000 seat arena to play in. And because they can't afford to pay the rates for it, they're given a sort of a discount rate, and then other men's sports have to pay more for their fixtures and so on. Now, on top of that, there's none of the commercial media outlets will pay to show the matches online or on cable or on television. So they can only get that. Again, they're being subsidised by giving free coverage in government-funded broadcasters. So when you add up the total sort of handouts in free media time, subsidised tickets, subsidised time in the bigger, more prominent arenas, sports arenas, and so on, you're talking well over $100 million a year. Now, if you took that money away, that sport would cease to exist. It would be, local amateur sides, having a bit of fun on the weekend or something like that. But it would cease to exist as a competitive sport. Now, if you look at all the women's sports that are occurring at a national or international level, all of them are heavily subsidised by taxpayers or through indirect means, through front organisations and so on. Whereas the men's sport, any men's sport that can't survive on its own through attracting eyeballs, then that sport doesn't exist. There are various men's sports that don't see the light of day in national or media terms, and again, they're just a bunch of guys running around having a bit of fun on the weekend or something. The over 50s soccer teams, of which there are many around the world, many in Australia. They don't get any coverage. Now they pull crowds of maybe a couple of hundred or something in them, and a lot of those would be just relatives of the men. So, but they could easily beat the women's national soccer team. So why aren't they getting coverage? Why aren't they getting subsidies? So this artificial subsidies creates this artificial level of fantasy that none of these sports could survive on their own merit. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't accomplished athletes within the women's sport. I used to date a tennis player, and she claimed, probably truly actually, that the only reason men come to watch the women's game is they want to check out the the hot legs of the women tennis players, and that maybe that's true. I don't know. I mean, it's possible. And she complained about that, though, that they should come and watch her skill. Now, she was an accomplished player. I mean, she was in the, I think it was the top 20 in Australia or something like that. But the point is, when it comes to watching a fast, competitive game of tennis, if you want that sort of level of clear competitiveness and the best person wins and all that sort of thing, you go and watch the men's game. And this was something that she only half appreciated. But I just wanted to sort of go over that, because I don't think the women's sport, unless, again, it can attract the eyeballs in its own right, I don't think they should be paid anywhere near what the men are paid. And I think all subsidies of women's sport, unless it's going to lead to something greater, like they're in that transition to a higher level of competence, unless it's that, I think all the subsidies should be removed. But that's only my view. What do you think? You've been fantastic today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.